There is a hollow in the Syrian steppe where the gravel plain dips and the limestone hills draw back, and in that hollow, before the light has fully come, the ground is gray and even, the color of ash that has lain undisturbed. The plain around it runs flat to the horizon in every direction, broken only by the long, low ridges that hold the basin like cupped hands, and the surface underfoot is gravel and crusted salt, the floor of a country that takes its rain in winter and gives it back to the air through the long, dry months. Water rose here from a single source, the spring the Palmyrines called Efka, sulphurous and warm, carrying the faint odor of the deep rock it had passed through, and where that water reached the surface, the date palms stood in a band of green that held against the brown of the steppe and could be seen from the ridgelines a long way off. The oasis was an interruption, a single legible mark in a landscape otherwise without marks, and it sat almost exactly on the seam between two worlds, the Mediterranean to the west and the valley of the Euphrates to the east, so that whatever moved between those worlds had reason to pass through this one green place. In the first light the palms held still, the fronds heavy with the night's cool, and the surface of the spring lay flat and dark, until the sun came over the eastern ridge and laid a line of pale gold across the water. The hills to the north and west are bare limestone, weathered into rounded shoulders, their slopes scattered with the loose stone that the city would later cut and dress and raise into columns. To the south, the ground opens toward the gardens, the irrigated plots that the spring and the channels drawn from it kept alive, and beyond the gardens, the open grazing where the flocks of the surrounding tribes moved with the seasons. The basin holds the heat and holds the silence. Sound carries far across the gravel, and a single bird crossing the early sky can be heard before it is seen. The steppe in every direction was a country of distance, a place a traveler crossed rather than a place a traveler stayed, and the spring at its center was the one reason to stop, so that the whole vast emptiness around the oasis was, in a sense, part of the city's situation, the measure of how far a body had to come to reach the water and how far it had to go on after leaving it. This was never a place chosen for beauty, though it has its own austere kind. It was a place chosen for water, and water in such a country is the one thing that gathers people, that turns a track across the desert into a road and a watering place into a city. The land made the terms and the people met them. The winters laid a thin grass over the gravel, and the summers burned it off again, and between the two the basin held its single steady green where the spring fed the palms, the one constant in a landscape of coming and going. Through the dawn the green band of the palms slowly took its color. The gray plain warmed toward fawn, and the limestone of the hills began to show the honey tone it carries at the start and the close of every day, the tone that the dressed stone of the streets would carry too, so that the city when it stood would seem to have been quarried out of the very light that fell on the basin. Across the gravel ran the faint converging lines of the tracks that came in toward the water, the worn ways by which men and beasts had approached the spring from every quarter of the steppe, each one a record in the surface of the ground of how often the crossing had been made and from where, and the lines drew together at the oasis as the spokes of a wheel draw toward the hub, so that the place could be read, even before a wall stood, as a gathering point, a knot in the open country where the routes that the water dictated came to a single head. The morning cold lay in the hollow longer than on the surrounding rise, the chill of the desert night pooling in the low ground until the climbing sun reached down into it, and the breath of the few beasts already moving showed for a while in the early air. The salt of the flats caught the first light in a pale glaze, and the gravel held the cool of the night against the warmth that was coming, and the whole basin lay in that suspended hour between the cold and the heat, neither yet the one nor the other, the air still and the light low, and the green of the palms slowly gathering its color out of the gray. The water rose, the palms stood, the plain ran out to the ring of hills, and the long day of the oasis began as it had begun for a great many years before there was anything here worth the name of a town. The city that rose around the spring was ordered along a single line, a colonnaded avenue that ran for more than a kilometer across the basin, and that avenue is the first thing the ground still shows of the plan. Along both sides stood the columns, hundreds of them, drums of the local limestone set one upon another and crowned with Corinthian capitals cut in the acanthus form, and partway up the shaft of each ran a bracket, a small projecting console where once a statue stood, a figure of a benefactor or a magistrate or a caravan leader named in the stone beneath. The avenue did not run perfectly straight. It bent, and at the principal bend the builders set a tetrapylon, 4 groups of 4 columns on a square platform, a hinge in the street that turned the eye from one stretch of the colonnade to the next, without ever letting it run to a vanishing point. At the eastern end of the great precincts stood the Temple of Bel, the largest sacred enclosure in the city, a walled court of considerable extent with the temple itself set within it, the cella raised on a podium and approached up a flight of steps, its long sides carrying engaged columns and its interior holding 2 inner chambers, the adyta, one at either end where the images of the gods were kept. The threshold of the cella was cut with a great monolithic lintel, carved on its underside, and the ceiling slabs of the inner chambers bore reliefs of the heavens, processions of deities, and the signs of the sky. Elsewhere across the city stood the Temple of Balshaman, smaller and more finely proportioned, its porch carried on slender columns. A theater with its curved seating cut and laid against a low rise, the stage building set with columns and niches, an agora, the broad rectangular court of public business, ringed with porticos and once crowded with the inscribed bases of honorific statues, and a monumental arch, wedge-shaped in plan, that resolved the angle where 2 stretches of the colonnade met and let the avenue change direction while seeming to continue. All of it was raised from the honey-colored limestone of the surrounding hills, cut at the quarries, dressed on the ground, and lifted into place, and the marks of the masons remain on the blocks, the Lewis holes by which the stones were hoisted, the fine claw-toothed dressing of the surfaces, the channels where iron cramps once tied one block to its neighbor. The orders were Greek and Roman in their grammar, the acanthus and the egg and dart and the dental course, but the hands were local and the stone was local, and the proportions carry a weight and a plainness that belong to the desert rather than to the coast. The columns of the great avenue were not uniform in their detail, raised as they were over a long span of years by many hands and many benefactors, and a patient eye reads in them the slow accumulation of the street, this stretch given by one family and that stretch by another, the brackets carrying the record of who had paid for what in the long building of the city. Behind the colonnade, the residential quarters spread in a looser grid, courtyard houses of mud brick on stone footings, their plans recoverable from the lines of their walls, the rooms arranged around open courts where the household work was done, the same form of dwelling repeated at many scales, the poorer house and the richer house built to the same idea of rooms gathered about an open center. The whole was held within a wall, repaired and retraced over the centuries, and the gates set the points where the desert roads entered the ordered space of the streets, so that a caravan coming in off the steppe passed from the open gravel through the gate and into the discipline of the avenue, from the trackless plain into the measured street. The city read as a single long gesture across the basin, the avenue carrying the eye from the gardens at one end to the great temple at the other, the side streets feeding into it, the public courts opening off it, and the columns standing in their hundreds to give the whole a rhythm that the eye could follow and the foot could walk. The water of the basin shaped the building as it shaped everything else. For the great cisterns and the channels that served the city were themselves works of construction, cut and lined and roofed in stone, and the discipline of moving and storing the water ran beneath the visible city as a second architecture, less seen but no less made. The masons worked the limestone close to where it would stand, the quarries on the slopes above the basin, giving up the blocks that were dressed on the ground below and raised into the walls and the colonnades, so that the city and the hills it came from were one material, the same pale stone in the cliff and in the capitol. The carving of the orders was done by hands trained in the Eastern manner as much as the Western, and the acanthus of the capitals and the vine and the figure on the brackets carry a fullness and a depth of cut that belong to the place, the Greek grammar of the building spoken in a local accent that the eye learns to read along the whole length of the avenue. What the builders made was legible, and a great deal of it is legible still: the line of the street, the squares of the courts, the podia of the temples, the brackets where the statues stood, the dressed stone holding the shape that the masons gave it. In the early hours, before the heat had gathered, the water carriers were already moving, down to the Efka spring and back through the residential quarters with the day's water, and the soft tread of their passage along the lanes was among the first sounds of the working city. The spring was the center of the morning round, for nothing in the basin happened without water, and the channels that carried it to the gardens and the cisterns that held it against the dry season were tended at first light. The gates of the channels opened and closed, the standing water in the cisterns drawn down. As the sun cleared the eastern ridge, the agora began to fill, and beside it the court where the caravan trade was reckoned, for the morning in Palmyra was given over to commerce and to the registration of goods. The men who organized the caravans, the synodiarchs, who had led a company of merchants across the desert and brought it home, settled their accounts in these hours, registered what they carried against the published tariff, paid what the city's law required on the goods and the animals and the very water the beasts had drunk on the road. Clerks worked at the tariff with the long lists before them, the rates for a camel load of one thing and a donkey load of another, the duty on dyed wool and on unguents and on the slaves who passed through the gates, and the merchants stood and waited and paid and were marked as having paid. Along the side streets the workshops opened their fronts to the lane, and the morning trades began, the weavers at their looms with the wool of the local flocks and the linen brought in for working, the dyers with their vats and the smell of the dye-stuffs hanging in the still air, the leather workers cutting and stitching the harness and the bags that the caravans consumed in great quantity, the bronze smiths at their small fires, the carvers of the limestone, roughing out the funerary busts that the city's families ordered for their tombs. In the courtyard houses the domestic mourning ran its own course, the ovens heated and the bread baked against the inner face of the clay, the grain ground, the flocks that were kept near the houses led out toward the grazing, the children set to the small tasks that a household finds for them. The bread came out of the ovens, and the smell of it moved along the lanes and mixed with the smell of the dye vats and the dung of the pack animals gathered at the caravanserais, and over all of it lay the dry mineral scent of the limestone dust that the masons raised wherever they worked. The pack camels were watered and loaded or unloaded at the edge of the built city, the long strings of them kneeling and rising, the drivers calling to them in the speech of the desert, and the goods came in off the road, the bales and the jars and the bound bundles, to be carried into the stores and the markets and reckoned and sold. Officials of the city moved among the porticos of the agora, the magistrates whose names the honorific statues recorded, the men who underwrote the caravans and were thanked in stone for it, and the business of the council was done in the morning cool, while the doing of it was still bearable. The Palmyrene speech, the local form of Aramaic, was the tongue of the lanes and the markets, and Greek was the tongue of the formal inscription and the wider trade, and both were heard in the agora in the morning, on the bilingual stones, and in the mouths of the men who stood beside them. By the time the sun stood well up and the shadows had drawn in tight against the column bases, the morning's commerce was largely done. The goods registered, the accounts settled, the workshops at their steady midday labor, and the city turned toward the long bright middle of the day, when the heat held the basin and the work moved into the shade. The caravanserais at the edge of the built city took in the companies that came off the road, the broad-walled yards where the camels were couched and the goods set down and the men found shelter. And the morning saw the sorting of all that a long caravan had carried. The bales opened and checked against the lists, the goods divided among the merchants who held shares in them, the damaged and the spoiled set aside. The money changers had their place in the round of the morning, the silver of the West weighed against the goods of the East, the coin of one issue set against the coin of another, the rates argued and agreed in the cool while the agreeing could be borne. The men and women who were bought and sold as part of the traffic of the city stood in the market among the other goods that the tariff counted, brought in along the same roads as the silk and the spice, and the morning's commerce reckoned them as it reckoned the rest, a hard fact of the trade that the stone of the tax law sets down without comment among the loads and the beasts. The pattern of the morning was the pattern of a place that lived by moving goods across a desert, water first and trade close behind it, the spring and the tariff court the two poles around which the early hours turned. South of the built city the morning ran to a different measure, slower and older, set by the run of the water rather than the reckoning of goods. For the gardens and the palm groves were a world of their own within the basin, and their day began with the opening of the channels. The water of the Efka was drawn off into a branching system of conduits, some running open across the surface, and some carried underground in the manner of the Kanat, and it reached the plots according to an apportionment that was strictly kept. Each garden allowed its share for a measured time. The flow turned from one channel into the next as the hours passed. The gardeners were at the channels at first light, lifting and setting the small barriers of earth and stone that sent the water this way and that, flooding a bed and then closing it and opening the next. The whole grove watered in turn through the cool of the morning before the sun could take too much of it back into the air. The date palms stood in their ranks above the lower plots, the tall trunks rising bare to the crown of fronds, and beneath them in the shade grew the grain and the fodder and the garden crops that the double shelter of the palms and the water made possible, a layered cultivation that wrung 2 and 3 uses from the same watered ground. In the season of pollination, the work climbed into the crowns, the male flower carried up and set among the female so that the fruit would form, and in the season of harvest it climbed again, the heavy clusters cut and lowered, the dates that were the staple sweetness of the oasis brought down and dried and stored. The gardens fed the city in the plainest way, the bread grain and the fodder for the beasts and the fruit of the palms, and they were tended by hands that never stood in the agora or led a caravan, the labor of the watered ground proceeding in its own quiet round below the commerce of the colonnade. The smell of the gardens in the morning was the smell of wet earth and green growth, a thing rare and particular in that dry country, held within the band of the irrigation and stopping abruptly where the channels stopped and the gravel began. Birds came to the watered ground that came nowhere else, and the sound of the water moving in the conduits ran under the work of the morning, the one continuous sound in a place where most sounds were brief. The division of the water was the great matter of the gardens, and disputes over it and rules for it lay close to the heart of the oasis economy, for the spring was finite, and the plots were many, and the dry months were long, so that the timing of a turn of water was a thing of real weight, watched and counted and held to. By the time the heat came down in earnest, the morning watering was done, the channels closed, the beds left to hold their moisture through the day under the shade of the palms, and the gardeners drew back into the shade themselves, the work of the watered ground following the same retreat from the midday heat that the work of the streets followed. The keeping of the channels was itself a labor that never ended, for the silt the water carried settled in the conduits and had to be cleared. The linings of stone and earth gave way and had to be made good. The underground runs had to be entered and tended along their length, and the men who held this work passed it from one generation to the next as a knowledge particular to the place, the map of the water held in the heads of those who worked it. The garden walls of mud and stone kept the watered ground apart from the grazing beyond, holding the flocks out of the crops and holding the precious moisture within. And the plots ran in their ordered squares from the higher ground, where the channels entered down to the lower ground, where the last of the water was spent. The dung of the folds was carried out to the beds and worked into the soil, the fertility of the oasis maintained by the patient return of what the flocks and the households gave back, so that the gardens were fed as carefully as they were watered, the one labor matched to the other through the round of the year. The gardens were the other half of what the spring made, the colonnade at one end of the water and the palm groves at the other, the trade and the tillage drawn from the same source, and the morning in the groves was as much the life of Palmyra as the morning in the agora, the quiet watered round beneath the tall palms keeping the city fed while the louder round of the caravans kept it rich. What the Palmyrenes made is best preserved in their stone and in their cloth, and the two together say a good deal about the city's hands and the city's reach. The limestone of the hills was the great material, soft enough to cut cleanly and to hold a fine line, hard enough to stand in a column for centuries, and the carvers of Palmyra worked it into a body of funerary sculpture that survives in greater quantity than almost any comparable thing from the Roman East. The dead were shown in bust, cut in low and high relief on the slabs that sealed their tombs, the men in tunic and mantle, sometimes with a scroll or a ring, the women laden with the jewelry that was clearly prized, the diadem and the brooch and the twisted necklace and the earring, the headdress drawn up and pinned, the whole rendered with a frontal stillness and a patient attention to the surface of cloth and the weight of ornament. Beside each figure, the carver set the name in the Palmyrene letters, sometimes the age, sometimes the word of mourning, so that the sculpture is at once a portrait and a document, a face and a line of writing held in the same block. The stone took paint, and traces of it remain in the sheltered cuts, the red and the black, and the faint earth tones that once gave the busts their color, so that what now stands pale and even was once worked up into something warmer and more particular. The carving repays a long look, for the jewelry on the women is rendered with such care that the very types of the ornament can be set in order and dated by their changes. The fashion of one generation giving way to the fashion of the next on the faces of the dead, a record of taste cut into the funerary stone. The textiles are the other great witness, recovered from the dry chambers of the tombs, where the desert air preserved what would have rotted anywhere wetter, and the range of them is itself a record of the trade. There is the local wool, spun and woven and dyed in the city's own vats, the everyday cloth of the everyday people. There is linen, worked and dyed and used for the wrapping of the dead. And there is silk, the fine imported thread that had come the whole length of the road from the east, some of it woven with patterns that belonged to distant looms, and some of it unpicked and rewoven in Palmyrene hands, the eastern thread carried west and turned to local use. To handle the record of these cloths is to handle the trade itself in miniature, the wool of the basin and the silk of the Far East lying together in the same tomb, the one made within sight of the spring, and the other carried across the width of a continent to end in the same dry chamber. Around the stone and the cloth lies the rest of the material life, the pottery turned and fired for the household and the store, the glass that came in as vessels and as cullet to be worked, the bronze of the fittings and the small implements, the iron of the tools and the cramps that tied the masonry. The pottery is the common clay of the region, the cooking wares blackened at the base, the storage jars with their thick walls, the finer tablewares that carried a slip and a sheen. The glass catches the light still, the thin walls of the unguent flasks and the cups, some of it local and some of it brought from the coastal workshops where the craft was older. The coinage, too, is part of the record, the bronze and the silver that passed in the markets, the issues that name the city, and in the later years the figures who ruled it. Small worn discs of metal that carried the city's name out along the same roads the goods traveled. The inscriptions are themselves a material of the city, cut in the Palmyrene letters and in the Greek, on the bases of the statues and the walls of the tombs and the faces of the altars, and the letters were often picked out in color, and the strokes deepened and ruled with care, so that the writing was as much a made and finished thing as the carving it accompanied. The funerary reliefs carried not only the face and the name, but the gesture, the hand raised to the veil, the fingers holding the spindle and the distaff that marked a woman of the house, the child held against the shoulder, the small attributes by which a life was summed in stone. And the reading of these has recovered a great deal of how the city saw itself and ordered its households. The jewelry worn by the carved women answers to the actual ornaments found in the ground, the gold and the inlaid stones, so that the sculpture and the buried object confirm one another, the image and the thing it showed brought back together by the spade. And through all of it runs the limestone, the one material that the basin gave in abundance and that the city used for everything that was meant to last, the columns and the lintels and the tomb slabs and the inscribed bases cut and dressed and carved and set, holding to this day the marks of the tools that shaped it, and, here and there, in the deep of a fold, the last trace of the color it once wore. The wealth that raised the columns and filled the tombs came from a single great fact of the city's position, that it lay on the desert crossing between the Roman world and the world of the Persian Gulf, and that it had the water to make the crossing possible. Caravans formed at Palmyra and went out across the steppe to the Euphrates, and down the river or across to it, and on by stages to the cities of Babylonia and to the head of the Gulf, where the sea trade of the Indian Ocean came up to meet the land trade of the desert. From the Gulf and the lands beyond it came the goods that the Mediterranean wanted and could not make, the silk that had traveled from far in the east, the cotton and the dyes, the spices and the aromatics, the pearls fished from the warm, shallow waters of the Gulf, the precious stones, the incense of the southern lands, and these were carried up through the desert and through Palmyra and on to the coast and the markets of the Roman provinces. What went the other way is less fully recorded, but ran in the manufactures and the coin of the Roman world, the worked metal and the glass and the wool and the silver by which the Eastern goods were paid for. The Palmyrines themselves were the carriers, not merely the host of a route that others worked. Their merchants went out and their merchants came home, and the city honored the men who led the caravans and brought them safely through, setting their statues on the brackets of the colonnade and cutting their names and their services into the stone. The trade was organized and it was taxed, and the record of the taxing survives in one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient economy, the Great Tariff that the city published in the year 137 of the Common Era, a long bilingual inscription in Palmyrene and Greek that fixed the duties to be paid on the goods and the animals and the water and the people who passed through the gates. The tariff names the rates for a camel load and an ass load, for slaves brought in for sale, for dyed and undyed wool, for unguents in alabaster and in goatskin, for the very use of the springs by the flocks and the caravans, and in naming them, it lays out the whole commercial life of the city as a list of things that moved and the price of moving them. The document is precise to a degree that brings the ordinary day of the market very close, distinguishing the load by the beast that carried it and the unguent by the vessel that held it, setting the small duties on the small things alongside the larger duties on the larger, so that the tax law reads almost as an inventory of everything that came and went through the gates of the oasis. The Palmyrene reach is marked far beyond the basin, in the stations and the inscriptions the merchants left along the road, at Dura Europos on the middle Euphrates, where Palmyrene gods and Palmyrene soldiers and Palmyrene script are all attested, in Babylonia where Palmyrene traders are recorded, and out at the very edge of the run, on the Gulf island of Karg, and at the ports where the desert trade touched the sea. The caravans were a considerable undertaking, companies of merchants and beasts and guards moving together for the safety of the group, financed by the wealthy of the city, and led by the men whom the inscriptions thank, and the timing of their going and their coming was set by the water on the route and the season of the year. The goods passed through, the duty was paid, the merchants were honored, and the city grew rich on the margin between the two great economies it stood between, neither making the silk nor buying the last of it, but carrying it across the gap that no one else could cross so well, because no one else held the water in the middle of the desert that the long crossing required. The wealth that the trade returned did not stay only in the hands of a few, though the great families held the most of it, for the caravan economy reached down through the city to the drivers and the guards and the makers of the harness and the keepers of the beasts, to the weavers who worked the imported thread and the carvers who cut the tombs that the merchants paid for, so that the whole population in some measure lived off the goods that passed through. The honors the city paid to its benefactors were a part of the economy as much as a part of its pride. For the man who underrode a caravan, or repaired a stretch of the colonnade, or supplied the water for a banquet, was repaid in the standing that the statue and the inscription gave him, and the giving and the honoring ran in a circle that bound the wealthy to the city and the city to its trade. The council managed the common affairs of this commerce, the tariff and the upkeep of the wells, and the dealings with the powers on either side, and the names of its officers come down on the stones beside the names of the gods and the merchants. That margin, taken on every load for generation upon generation, is what stands in the colonnade and the temples and the tombs. The stone is the trade made solid, the duty on 1,000 caravans turned into capitals and lintels, and the carved faces of the merchants who paid it. Behind the ledgers and the tariff lay the road itself, the long physical crossing that the caravans made. And that crossing is its own chapter of the city's life, recorded in the inscriptions that the merchants and the guards left along the way. A caravan was not a single line of beasts on a marked track, but a moving community. The merchants with their goods, the drivers with the camels, the guards with their bows, the whole company bound together for the weeks of the journey and dependent on one another for the safety that no traveler could find alone in that country. The route ran east and south from the oasis across the open steppe toward the Euphrates, by way of the watering points that alone made the crossing possible, the wells and the seasonal pools where the company could halt and drink the beasts and refill the skins. The stages of the journey set not by distance but by water, each day's march reaching from one source to the next. At the river, the desert trade met the river trade, and the goods went down toward Babylonia and the head of the Gulf, to the town the Greeks called Spasinu Charax, near the mouth of the river system, where the merchants of Palmyra kept their station, and from which the sea trade reached out into the Gulf and beyond, to the coasts of Arabia and the ports of the western ocean of the east. The Palmyrines left their mark all along this run, most fully at Dura Europos, on the middle Euphrates, where their gods were worshipped and their soldiers garrisoned, and their script cut into the walls. A Palmyrene presence held far from the home basin on the very edge between the empires. The guarding of the caravans was a real and a costly thing, for the steppe held its own dangers, and the company carried wealth, and the city raised and honored the mounted archers who rode with the caravans and held the road, a body of horse and camel, whose skill became known well beyond the desert, and whose service the honorific inscriptions set down alongside the service of the merchants they protected. The men who led these expeditions, who financed them and brought them through and answered for them, were the great names of the city, thanked again and again in the stone of the colonnade for having led the caravan up from the river or down to it and brought it home entire. And the repetition of that praise across many statues is the clearest measure of how much the safe crossing mattered, and how much was owed to the man who could be trusted to make it. The journey took its toll in time and in beasts and at times in lives, and the wealth that reached the markets of the coast had been carried, load by load, across a width of desert that few would cross for any lesser reason, by men who knew the wells and the seasons and the dangers and made the crossing nonetheless, year upon year, because the margin at the end of it was worth the weeks of the road. The knowledge that made the crossing possible was a thing held and handed on, the lie of the wells and the timing of their water, the reading of the weather and the ground, the marks by which a course was held across a country with few fixed features, and this knowledge was as much the property of the caravan men as any bale they carried, the unwritten chart of the desert kept in the experience of those who had crossed it before. The companies carried their gods with them, the small images and the tokens of the deities of the road, and they raised altars at the stages of the journey and at the towns where they wintered, so that the religion of the home city traveled the length of the route in the baggage of its merchants, and is found today wherever they halted. The losses were real and were counted, the beast that failed and the load that was spoiled, and the man who did not come home. And against these the company set the guards and the numbers and the care of the leader, the safety of the many bought by the discipline of moving together. The colonnade that stands in the basin is the near end of a line that reached to the Euphrates and the Gulf and the sea beyond, and every column of it was paid for, in the last reckoning, by the long patient crossing of the dry country between. When the heat had passed its height, and the sun had begun its long fall toward the western ridge, the colonnade threw its shade across the avenue, and the public life of the city gathered again, no longer for the morning's commerce, but for the slower civic and social round of the evening. The light at that hour lay along the street in bands, gold where it fell between the columns and blue-gray where the shadows reached, and the dressed limestone warmed to the same honey tone it had worn at dawn, so that the avenue seemed at the close of the day to return to the color it had opened with. The men who had spent the morning at the tariff and the workshops now moved into the other half of the city's life, the round of association and patronage and the shared meal. And chief among the gatherings were the banquets of the religious societies, the marzia, the companies of men who met under a chosen leader to eat and drink together in the name of a god. The leader of the marzia for his term was a man of standing, named and honored, the one who provided the wine and presided at the table, and the gathering itself was at once a devotion and a fellowship, the sacred and the social held together in the same act of eating. The tesserae, the small tokens of clay and other stuffs that admitted a man to the banquet, survive in their hundreds, stamped with the figures of the gods and the names of the priests and the leaders, and they are the physical residue of these evening gatherings, the ticket to the table, preserved long after the table and the wine and the men were gone. Along the colonnade, the honorific statues looked down from their brackets, the figures of the day's benefactors and the past benefactors, the caravan leaders and the magistrates and the priests, each on his console with his name cut beneath, so that the evening walk along the avenue was a walk among the remembered notables of the city, the living, moving beneath the carved likenesses of the honored. In the agora and the porticos, the talk ran on these days' business and the season's caravans and the affairs of the council. The same men who had paid their duty in the morning, now standing at their leisure among the inscribed bases that recorded their standing. In the residential quarters, the domestic evening drew the households in, the flocks brought back to the folds near the houses, the cooking fires lit in the courtyards, the smell of the evening meal moving along the lanes as the smell of the morning bread had moved along them hours before. The day's water was reckoned and the cisterns checked against the night, and the children were called in from the lanes and the courts. As the sun went down behind the western hills, the temples closed their courts, the great precinct of Bel drawing its gates against the dusk, and the colonnade emptied of its evening crowd, the statues left to keep their watch over the darkening street. The same period that the morning had shown as a place of trade, the evening showed as a place of company and devotion, and the slow domestic gathering of a town settling toward night, the two halves of the one day, the commerce and the fellowship, the spring and the table, the caravan court and the banquet hall, and over both the same low golden light falling along the same long avenue between the same standing columns. The lamps were lit in the houses and the halls as the last of the daylight went, the small clay lamps that burned the oil of the country, and the carved lampstands in the niches that held them are among the household things the tombs and the houses have given up, the means by which the evening was held a little longer against the coming of the dark. In the courts of the houses, the work of the day gave way to the gathering of the household, the telling and the talk, the children settled, the bread of the morning eaten again at the evening meal, the same plain round that any settled people keeps, lived here within the stone frame of a city that the trade had made rich and the desert kept apart. The watchmen took their places at the gates and along the wall as the dark came down, for the city that grew wealthy on the road had to keep its wealth. And the night closed over the basin with the lamps showing here and there in the houses and the great dark mass of the temple precinct standing against the last light in the western sky. The light failed by degrees, the gold withdrawing up the shafts of the columns and off the capitals and into the sky, and the basin held the warmth of the day a while longer before the desert cold came down, and the city that had worked through the morning and rested through the heat and gathered through the evening drew at last into its houses and its sleep. The religion of Palmyra drew on every world the city touched, and its gods carry the marks of all of them, the old powers of Mesopotamia and the Aramean lands, the deities of the Arab tribes of the steppe, and the gods of the Greek and Roman West, gathered into a single crowded heaven and worshipped in the city's own way. At the head of the great precinct stood Bel, a god of the sky and of the city itself, set within a triad with the moon god Aglabol and the sun god Yarhibol. The three of them shone together on the reliefs of the temple, the lunar crescent at the shoulders of the one and the radiate nimbus at the head of the other. Baal Shaman, the lord of the heavens, held his own fine temple and his own following. Alat, a goddess of the Arab tribes, was worshipped under her own name, and was drawn together with the figure of Athena in the manner of the time. And there was the god whom the inscriptions do not name, but call only the one whose name is blessed forever, addressed in gratitude on a great many altars without ever being named outright. The cult of these gods ran less to public spectacle than to the quieter acts of dedication and the shared banquet, the raising of an altar in thanks, the cutting of a votive relief, the gathering of the marzia at the god's table. The temples were houses for the images rather than theaters for a crowd. The cella of Bel holding its two inner shrines where the gods were kept and brought out in procession on the appointed days, the reliefs of the ceiling showing the order of the heavens above the heads of those who entered. One of those reliefs shows a procession with a veiled woman and the camel that bore the sacred image, the rite of the god carried through the streets on its day, and another sets out the gods in their ranks beneath the signs of the sky, the religion of the city written across the stone of its own ceiling for those who came into the shrine to read. The other great work of the Palmyrene sacred life lay outside the walls, in the city of the dead that spread across the ground beyond the gates. For the Palmyrenes housed their dead with a care and a permanence that has left some of the most distinctive monuments of the ancient world. There were the tower tombs, tall square shafts of dressed limestone rising several stories, their interiors divided into tiers of burial niches. The loculi, each long slot meant to hold a body and to be sealed at its mouth with a carved slab bearing the portrait and the name of the one within. There were the underground tombs, the hypogea, cut down into the rock and branching into galleries lined with the same stacked niches, their entrances closed and their interiors holding the family dead across the generations. And there were the temple tombs, built in the form of houses for the gods but raised over the dead, the latest of the funerary forms, fronted with columns and rich with carving. Within all of them the principle was the same, the body laid in its niche, and the niche sealed with the carved face of the dead, so that the tomb was lined with portraits, tier upon tier of stilled frontal figures looking out from the stone, the whole family present in effigy in the chambers where the bodies lay. The funerary banquet appears again and again on the larger reliefs, the dead man reclining at the meal with his household gathered about him, the same act of eating together that the marzia performed in life, carried over into the imagery of death. The tombs were owned and bought and sold like other property, divided among heirs, with the deeds of their division sometimes cut into the stone of the doorway, so that the housing of the dead was a matter of family right and family record as much as of devotion. The tower passing down the generations as the bodies accumulated in its niches. There was no drama in any of it, no spectacle of sacrifice raised to a public pitch. There was dedication, and there was the shared table, and there was the long, patient housing of the dead in their carved and named niches outside the walls. and the sacred year of the city turned on these quiet, recurring acts rather than on any single climax of devotion. The priests of the city held a recognized place in its order, their offices named on the stones and their figures shown in the particular flat cap that marked them. And the service of the gods was woven into the standing of the families who furnished the priesthoods and endowed the cults. The votive altars accumulated in the sanctuaries across the generations, each one raised by a man in thanks or in petition, and inscribed with his name and the name of the god and the year, so that the floors of the holy places filled slowly with the record of private devotion, altar beside altar, the gratitude of the city set down one stone at a time. The care of the dead reached beyond the ceiling of the niche, for the tombs were visited and the funerary banquet was kept in their memory. The living gathering at the tomb as the Marzia gathered at the god's table, and the offerings left and the meals shared at the graves bound the dead into the continuing life of the family rather than setting them apart from it. The gods kept their precincts within the walls, and the dead kept their towers and their galleries without. And between the two, the living moved, dedicating, banqueting, burying, and being in their turn carved and named and sealed into the stone. The year in the basin was set by the desert and by the water, and the city's calendar followed the movement of the flocks and the caravans and the slow turning of the agricultural round, rather than any crowded sequence of festivals. The winter brought the rains, such as they were, the gray weather coming down over the steppe and greening the gravel plain for a season with the thin, quick grass that the desert gives after rain. And in those weeks, the surrounding tribes pastured their flocks on the seasonal grazing, moving the animals out across the plain to the green and bringing them in again. And the cisterns of the city filled with the runoff, and the channels ran, and the stored water was renewed against the long dry stretch to come. The winter was the time of water and of grass, the basin at its most generous, the plain briefly soft and colored, and the rhythm of the pastoral life quickened to take what the rains gave before they were gone. As the year turned toward the heat, the green withdrew, the grass dried and was grazed down to nothing, the plain returned to its fawn and gray, and the flocks were drawn back toward the permanent water of the spring and the gardens, and the city's dependence on the Efka and the cisterns grew with each rainless week. The summer was the season of heat and of careful water, the spring carrying its steady warm flow, while the surface of the plain baked and the air over the gravel shimmered, and the very tariff of the city taxed the use of the springs and the water by the flocks and the caravans, a sign of how closely the water was held and counted in the dry months. The caravans timed their going and their coming to the water on the rote and the season of the year. For a company of men and beasts crossing the desert to the Euphrates and beyond had to find water at its stages, and the seasons of the rain and the seasons of the drought set the windows in which the long crossing could be made and the goods brought through. The gardens and the palm groves kept their own slower cycle within the protection of the irrigation, the dates ripening through the heat toward the harvest, the irrigated plots yielding their grain and their fruit and their fodder under the channels drawn from the spring, the one reliably green ground in a country that was green only in patches and only for a season. The festivals of the gods fell at their appointed times within this larger frame, but the inscriptions and the remains speak less of a festival calendar than of this underlying rhythm of water and grass and harvest and caravan, the pastoral year of the tribes and the agricultural year of the gardens and the commercial year of the trade, all turning together on the single pivot of the water. When the rains came, the plain opened, and the flocks went out, and the cisterns filled. When the rains failed, the plain closed, and the flocks came in, and the water was counted, And the caravans went out and came home in the seasons that the water on the long road allowed, and the dates ripened in the groves, and the year turned in the basin as it had turned before the city stood and would turn after it. The flocks of the surrounding tribes and the settled life of the city were bound together by the year, for the pastoral people brought their wool and their beasts and their cheese to the markets of the oasis, and took away the goods of the gardens and the workshops. And the moving and the settled lived off one another across the turning seasons, the one keyed to the grazing and the other to the trade, both keyed in the end to the water. The storing against the dry months was a constant care, the grain laid up and the dates dried, and the water held in the cisterns. The abundance of the wet season carried over to bear the city through the long heat, and the granaries and the storehouses were as much a part of the city's survival as the spring itself. The desert gave little warning and less margin, and a year when the winter rains failed pressed hard on the flocks and the gardens alike, so that the reading of the season and the careful keeping of the stores were not habit alone, but the difference, in a hard year, between plenty and want. The light itself marked the seasons, the low slanting winter sun that lay long across the colonnade, and the high hard summer sun that stood almost overhead and drew the shadows in tight, and between the two the year moved, the wet and the dry, the green and the fawn, the going out and the coming in, the whole life of the basin, keyed to the water that rose at the spring and fell, when it fell at all, out of the winter sky. For a brief span in the 3rd century, the city rose beyond its merchant standing into something larger, and then it came down again, and the coming down emptied the great colonnade of its old function without ever quite emptying it of people. The rise was the work of 2 figures whom the records name: Odaenathus, a lord of the city, who took up the defense of the Roman East against the Persians, and gathered to himself the titles and the power of a regional ruler, and after him the Queen Zenobia, who governed in the name of her young son, and for a few years extended the reach of Palmyra across the Roman East into Egypt and into Anatolia, holding a span of territory altogether out of proportion to the basin from which it was ruled. It was a brief ascendancy, and Rome did not let it stand. The Emperor Aurelian brought his armies east, met and broke the Palmyrene forces in the field, and took the city in the campaign of the years 272 and 273. And when the city rose again after his first settlement, he returned and put the revolt down, and the great days of independent Palmyra were over. What followed was not a sudden emptiness, but a long contraction. A Roman garrison held the place, and later the camp laid out under Diocletian gave a part of the city over to the soldiers, and the administrative and military life of a frontier post replaced the old commercial life of a caravan capital. The trade that had been the city's whole reason did not vanish at a stroke, but the routes shifted with the shifting fortunes of the empires the city had stood between, and the long crossing that Palmyra had served grew less needful as other ways carried the goods and other powers held the desert, and the margin that had raised the columns thinned, and the wealth that had filled the tombs ran lower. The city did not fall in any single hour. It was taken and garrisoned and turned to other uses, and slowly relieved of the function that had called it into being. Through the centuries that followed, the Byzantine and then the early Islamic, the place was still occupied. Churches were raised within the old fabric, and the early Muslim period left its own mark, and the name endured in the form of Tadmur, the old Semitic name that the city had always carried beneath its Greek one. The great houses passed out of use or were divided. The brackets of the colonnade emptied of their statues, the agora grew quiet. The tariff that had counted every load through the gate became a stone that no one any longer had reason to consult. The honorific bases, raised one after another to the men who had led the caravans, were the record of an order that no longer held, and they stood among the columns as the writing of a commerce that had moved on, read now only by those who came to measure the stones. But the great caravan economy was gone, the synodiarchs and their companies, the tariff court and the crowded agora, the statues raised to the merchants who brought the silk through the desert, and the monumental city built on that trade was left standing over a life much smaller than the one it had been built for. The columns kept their line, and the temples kept their precincts, and the towers kept their dead, and the people who remained lived among them, in and around the great stone frame of a city whose purpose had moved on. The shifting of the trade was the deeper cause beneath the conquest, for a city that lived by carrying goods across a gap could not outlast the gap itself. And as the powers on either side rose and fell, and the routes that joined them moved, the long desert crossing that Palmyra alone had served so well became one way among others, and then a way little used, and the wealth that had come of being necessary thinned as the necessity passed. The garrison that held the place in the later centuries lived a smaller and a guarded life among the great stones, the soldiers quartered in the old fabric, the wall repaired for defense rather than for show, the city turned from a hub of the trade into a post on a frontier. The people who stayed kept the spring and the gardens, for the water did not fail though the trade did, and a settled life continued in the oasis through all the centuries that followed, smaller and quieter, gathered close about the source that had called the first people to the place. There was no drama in the long settling, no single moment that the eye can fix on as the end. There was a conquest, and then a garrison, and then a slow turning of the trade away, and then the centuries, and at the close of them the colonnade still stood across the basin, and the spring still rose, and the dead still lay in their towers, and the city that had carried the wealth of two empires across the desert had become a town beside the ruins of itself. What stands now stands on the open plain east of the modern town, the dressed limestone holding its line across the basin where the spring still marks the center of the old oasis. The great colonnade runs as it ran, the columns standing in their long file along the avenue, some fallen and some upright, the brackets still showing on the shafts where the statues were once set, the line of the street legible from end to end across the gravel. The tetrapolon stands at its bend in the avenue, rebuilt in part from the fallen stone, and the theater holds its curve of seating against the low rise, the stage building set with its niches behind. At the eastern end, the precinct of Bel keeps its great walled court and the podium of its temple, the carved lintel and the reliefs of the ceiling among the finest things the city left. And across the western ground, the funerary towers rise out of the necropolis, the tall square shafts of the tomb builders standing over the galleries of their dead. The site has been studied for more than a century, by French and Polish and Syrian missions and by others, the plans drawn and the inscriptions read and the sculpture and the textiles carried into the museums where they are kept. The whole great body of the Palmyrene record assembled stone by stone and slab by slab and thread by thread, until the city that lived by carrying goods across the desert is known to us chiefly through the patient measuring of what it left in the ground. The ground holds what the records do not, and a great part of what is known of Palmyra has come not from any chronicle, but from the inscriptions on the bases and the tombs, the bilingual stones that name the merchants and the gods and the years, read off the limestone by those who came after. The museums hold what the ground gave up, the funerary busts ranged in their rows, the textiles kept in the dark against the light that would fade them, the tokens and the altars and the inscribed stones, and from these the city has been pieced together far more fully than its few mentions in the ancient writers would ever allow. The bilingual stones in particular, giving back the names and the dates and the offices of a society that would otherwise be almost silent. The plans drawn over the long seasons of excavation set out the whole shape of the place, the avenue and the precincts and the necropolis, the houses and the channels and the wall, so that the city can be walked in the mind from the spring to the great temple and out among the towers of the dead. The carved faces look out from the museum cases as they looked out from the tombs, the names beside them still legible, the patient attention of the ancient carver answered now by the patient attention of those who read and record what was cut. It was inscribed as a property of World Heritage, recognized for the very things that the centuries had spared, the colonnade, and the temples and the towers and the tariff and the carved faces of the dead. In the years of the recent war, several of the monuments were damaged, the Temple of Bel and the Temple of Baal-Shaman, and the Arch and some of the funerary towers among them. And the work of documenting what was damaged and steadying and in part restoring what remains has gone on since, the record taken up again where the violence broke it. The pieces of the fallen stone were gathered and recorded where they lay, the carved blocks numbered and set aside, so that what had stood for the better part of 2,000 years and come down in a season might be read and held and in some measure raised again. What we have measured. The colonnade still throws its shade across the avenue in the late light, the dressed limestone warming to its honey tone as the sun goes down behind the western hills, the spring lying flat and dark in the gardens where the palms still stand, the towers of the dead keeping their long watch over the western ground. The plain runs out to the ring of low hills as it ran before there was a city, and the gravel holds the heat of the day into the dusk, and the columns stand along the line the masons gave them, and the basin fills with the blue of the evening as the gold withdraws up the shafts and off the capitals and into the sky. The site is still there. The city is not. The stones remain, and in the low light at the close of the day, they hold the shape and the color of the place that the spring once gathered out of the desert, and the long avenue carries the eye from the gardens to the great precinct as it always did, and the silence of the basin comes down over the standing stone.